work. I know how good they are. I'm going to talk about the general approach that we call civic republicanism, and I'm going to talk about the history of it to some slight degree and give you a sense of why I think it's both an intriguing, interesting, and important political tradition which it's particularly important that we reclaim in contemporary democratic politics, not just in Spain, but more broadly. I call it civic republicanism because it got its name from the res publica, which was the Roman Latin name for the public affair. And this approach began in Rome, as I'll explain in a moment, where politics was conceived of essentially as not the business just of a king or a prince, but of the public. A res publica, a public business. I'm not sure that republicanism is actually the best name in contemporary usage, because most people think republicanism, well, that just means not having a king. That makes it particularly unsuitable for a Spanish context. We'll perhaps talk about that in discussion. I might prefer really call it by a new name, but neologisms are always dangerous. If I were to call it by a new name, I'd call it something like, in English, civicism, in Spanish, civismo, ciudadanismo, perhaps something of that kind. But let me go to the history. I think it all begins with Aristotle. Many of you will know Aristotle's Politics. And there are two ideas that are really positive and important that already appear in that book, quite remarkably, because we accept those two ideas as basic today, almost 2,500 years later. The first idea is that government, if it's to be even legitimate, if it's to be a true government, as Aristotle says, has got to be for the common good, which Aristotle takes to mean it's got to involve a rule of law, a government in which laws are passed not with a view to benefiting this group or that group, this individual or that individual, but in which laws are passed that treat everybody as equal and that are blind, so to speak, to the differences between people. That's one idea, the rule of law idea, let's call it, or the common good idea. He takes them to be the same. The second idea is that if government is, as we would say, to be democratic, as he would say, if government is to treat people as free, then it should involve either rotation and participation, as he thought possible in a small city like Athens, but if not that, at least election and accountability. So we elect those who govern and we hold them to account. We watch them and we subject them to review and account. We hold them to challenge. That's the second idea. So government to be legitimate has got to be a rule of law for the common good, and to be democratic it's got to involve election and accountability. But there was one issue that Aristotle didn't address, and those who came later thought of it as an oversight, a mistake. Aristotle seems to have envisaged the democracy on a model that Athens represented more or less. And that was a model in which one body, in Athens it was called the ecclesia, from which we actually get the word church, ecclesia, or assembly. And he thought that in a democracy all power would be exercised by that one body, the ecclesia. Now, come forward 200 years, and a Greek slave, though slave is misleading because he was really a tutor, he was an educated person, a man called Polybius, comes to Rome and lives as technically the slave, but actually the local intellectual, with a very distinguished Roman family. And Polybius writes a history of Rome. And one book of that history is called the Roman Constitution, the Roman dispensation, the Roman way of doing things. And what Polybius argued was that Aristotle had missed out on one thing. He agreed with Aristotle that there should be a rule of law for the common good. He agreed that there should be election and accountability. But he argued, thirdly, that power should not be held in one set of hands. He argued, in fact, that Rome was something of an ideal, because in Rome there were there were three bodies that could pass laws, three separate bodies. We have a bicameral parliament. We've got two houses of parliament in most Western democracies, including Spain's. In Rome there were actually three, and these bodies could independently make the law. But equally in Rome there were different officials, and power was spread out in the hands of these officials, who were in turn elected by the people. So you had the consuls, but not one consul, you had two consuls. And you'd got a number of, at every level of authority, official power, you had a number of figures who checked and balanced one another. You even had officials called the tribunes of the people, whose job it was to veto what the Senate or the other officials were proposing if they thought that what they were proposing was not for the common good. Now, Polybius thought, this is wonderful, because what this is power is dispersed. It's in many different hands. Law-making power is in the hands of different bodies, and executive power is in the hands of different officials. And judicial power, the power of the courts, is equally in the hands of different courts and independent courts. He introduced a word which was already in existence. He called it a mixed constitution. And he said Rome, Republican Rome, was really as near as you could get to an ideal of a polity. He fashioned thereby our image of the ideal republic. The Romans, of course, loved it. So Polybius came and he told them that they had discovered more or less the perfect way of organizing society. They all believed him, unsurprisingly. And their historians, for example, Livy, famously Sallust, they all passed on that story. Cicero, the great lawyer and public figure, and of course speech maker, writer, he equally internalized it. And they set up a model of Rome as the mixed constitution, the perfect society that embodied the Aristotelian ideas, but equally added this idea that you could have government split in many hands. Why did Polybius think that was so good? Well, because he said about Athens that it was like a ship without a commander, blown about by the winds of public opinion. And it's true that the Athenian ecclesia, for example, at the time of the Peloponnesian War, constantly switched views and switched sides. So he had that as his criticism there. And he said Rome escapes that precisely because there are many bodies that can check and balance one another. And that's an essential